Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and even more remarkable near-death experiences of medieval mothers. The women who braved childbirth in an era when your best prenatal care was a prayer and your midwife also moonlighted as the village gossip. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Preparing for birth. Childbirth in the medieval world was a universal experience, but also a profoundly dangerous one. Today, you might think of hospitals, doctors, antiseptics, and pain relief. In the Middle Ages, none of these existed. The process of giving birth was a ritual of endurance, community, and risk, shaped by beliefs that mixed faith, superstition, and hard-earned practical wisdom. When a woman neared the end of her pregnancy, preparations for the birth began. Unlike today, where men often stand by their partners, childbirth in medieval Europe was an almost exclusively female domain. The birthing chamber would be closed to men, husbands included, unless disaster struck. Instead, a small community of women would gather. Chief among them was the midwife, sometimes referred to as the wise woman, whose role was both practical and spiritual. She carried with her not only a set of skills passed down through generations, but also prayers, charms, and herbal remedies meant to shield both mother and child from danger. The room itself was carefully prepared. Windows were often shuttered, not only to keep out the cold, but also to prevent wandering spirits from entering. Fireplaces or braziers were lit, both to warm the mother and to symbolize the flame of life. Religious images were sometimes hung nearby, invoking divine protection. The birthing stool or chair, a sturdy piece of furniture with an opening in the seat, was placed in the center, though in poorer households, a simple bed or bundle of blankets had to suffice. Midwives carried a kit of tools and remedies. Herbs like pennyroyal, mugwort, and sage were used to encourage contractions. Oils and ointments were applied to ease pain or to help the child slip into the world. In some cases, relics or blessed objects were brought into the room to provide spiritual aid when medical skill reached its limits. Yet for all the ritual and care, childbirth remained perilous. Estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 3 women might die during childbirth or from complications afterwards. These numbers varied by time and place, but the danger was constant. For every birth, hope was balanced by fear. For the mother, diet and lifestyle during pregnancy were believed to play a major role. Medical texts, often rooted in the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, advised moderation in food, avoidance of sudden emotions, and restraint from sexual activity late in pregnancy. A woman's humors, the 4 bodily fluids thought to govern health, were thought to need balance, and any imbalance might endanger the birth. Beyond the physical risks, childbirth was deeply spiritual. Many women confessed sins in the days before labor, fearing death. Priests might be summoned, both to bless the mother and to stand ready for emergency baptism of the infant. For in an age when infant mortality was high, baptism was a crucial safeguard of the child's eternal soul. From the outside, childbirth might have seemed a hidden, almost secret world of women. Yet it was also a public matter, for every child born was a new member of the community, a new link in family survival, a new potential worker or heir. Neighbors might listen from outside the chamber, waiting for the cry of a child, or the silence that could signal tragedy. As the mother entered labor, chants and prayers were whispered, charms were tied around wrists, and midwives prepared for hours, sometimes days, of work. In this fragile space between life and death, medieval childbirth unfolded, a mixture of human resilience and the ever-present shadow of mortality. And yet, as the mother sat upon the birthing stool, gripping the hands of the women around her, one thought lingered above all others. Would this be a moment of joy or of grief? The ordeal of labor. Labor in the medieval world was not only a physical trial, but also a deeply symbolic event. To you, listening now, the thought of giving birth without modern medicine may sound almost unthinkable. Yet for women of the Middle Ages, this was the ordinary expectation of life. Pain, endurance, and faith became inseparable parts of the process. The moment labor began, the birthing chamber was sealed into a world of its own. Doors were closed, curtains drawn, and the space filled with women's voices, sometimes hushed with concern, sometimes uplifted in prayer. The mother's cries would echo in the room, met with murmured encouragement from the midwife and her assistants. Though each labor was unique, the midwife relied on her experience and inherited knowledge. She could read the body's signals, the rhythm of contractions, the child's movements, the tension in the mother's muscles. The birthing stool was central to this ordeal. Unlike lying flat on a bed, which was often considered impractical, the stool positioned the mother upright, using gravity to help the process. The stool typically had two sturdy handles to grip and a crescent-shaped seat to allow the child to pass through. If no stool was available, women gave birth kneeling, squatting, or supported by attendants who held them under the arms. In any case, birth demanded a posture of endurance. Pain was expected. In fact, it was often seen as inevitable, even divinely ordained. The biblical story of Eve's punishment in Genesis was frequently invoked. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children. For medieval Christians, labor pains were not simply unfortunate. They were part of a cosmic order, a burden borne by all women since the fall. That theological perspective left little room for efforts to fully relieve pain. Instead, the focus was on easing the process and protecting against danger. To accomplish this, the midwife might anoint the mother with warm oils or brew infusions of herbs like rue, chamomile, or fennel. These were thought to strengthen contractions or soothe anxiety. A small amount of wine or ale could be offered, both as comfort and as mild pain relief. In more desperate cases, stronger remedies might be tried, but always with caution, since too much could weaken the mother at the most critical moment. Superstition mingled with medical practice. Certain charms were believed to ease labor. The recitation of specific psalms, the tying of a blessed girdle around the mother's waist, or the placing of relics near the birthing stool. Some households even kept objects like stones or rings engraved with protective prayers, passed down through generations. These were pressed into the mother's hands during her most difficult moments, offering reassurance when human skill faltered. The role of the midwife extended beyond the practical. She was not only a guide through physical suffering, but also the keeper of hope. In the candlelight, her calm voice carried authority, forged through experience. Some midwives learned their craft formally, apprenticing under older women. Others gained knowledge through necessity, called upon to help relatives or neighbors until they became recognized for their skill. Despite their importance, midwives often walked a thin line of social acceptance. If too many births ended in tragedy, they risked whispers of incompetence, or worse, accusations of witchcraft. As the hours dragged on, the outcome remained uncertain. For many women, labor stretched across a full day, sometimes two. Each contraction brought the possibility of new life closer, yet exhaustion threatened to overwhelm. The midwife's hands guided, massaged, and, in some cases, intervened directly if the child's position seemed wrong. Without the tools of modern obstetrics, her ability to recognize and respond quickly was often the difference between survival and death. Still, complications were common. Breech births, where the child entered feet first, were particularly feared. Prolonged labor might exhaust both mother and child. In some texts, advice was given on repositioning the baby through careful pressure or manipulation, though success varied. If the child was stuck, prayers intensified, for few options remained. Surgical intervention, such as the later cesarean, was almost always fatal for the mother and was generally attempted only if she had already died or was beyond saving, in hopes of rescuing the infant's soul through baptism. Through all of this, the community of women offered endurance. The birthing room was a space where social rank often dissolved. Wealthy women and peasants alike faced the same dangers, bound together by a common experience of suffering and hope. For those outside the chamber, anticipation hung heavy. Husbands paced or waited in silence, barred from entry. Neighbors gathered in whispered groups, speculating on the outcome. A successful birth meant new life and new stability for the household. A death, however, could unravel family fortunes and leave children motherless. At last, if fortune allowed, the cries of the infant pierced the air, cutting through exhaustion and fear. The midwife wrapped the child in swaddling bands, inspected its breathing, and if necessary, performed an emergency baptism herself with a few drops of water, an accepted practice if the priest could not arrive in time. For in that moment, spiritual safety was as vital as physical survival. And yet, not all births ended with such a cry. In some cases, silence greeted the room. The midwife then faced grim choices, attempting to resuscitate with primitive methods or preparing to inform the family of loss. In a world without modern knowledge of infection, stillbirth, and congenital disease. Such tragedies were frequent and often unexplainable. Every successful delivery was therefore a triumph, not only of survival, but of community resilience. It was a moment when tradition, faith, and endurance converged. And yet, once the child was delivered, the story was far from over. For the days immediately following birth were often the most perilous of all. What, then, awaited the mother and her newborn in those fragile first days, when joy was shadowed by risk? After birth, survival and consequences. The safe delivery of a child, when it happened, was only the beginning of another trial. You might imagine a moment of relief once the infant's cry filled the chamber, but in the medieval world, the days immediately following childbirth were fraught with danger. Both mother and newborn remained in a state of vulnerability, their lives balanced precariously between recovery and decline. For the mother, the greatest threat came from infection and blood loss. Without knowledge of germs or antiseptic practices, even a seemingly smooth birth could turn deadly in the hours that followed. Midwives might attempt to cleanse the mother using herbal washes or poultices of rosemary, myrrh, or vinegar, but their understanding was limited. What we now know as puerperal fever, caused by bacterial infection, was one of the leading killers of women after childbirth. Medieval records rarely used medical terms. Instead, they described such deaths as fevers, fluxes, or weakness after labor. Behind these vague phrases, thousands of women perished silently in their homes. Diet and rest were prescribed, though the demands of household life often cut recovery short. Wealthier women, especially among the nobility, could retreat into a period known as lying in, where they were secluded from daily work, nourished with special foods, and attended by servants or kin. Poorer women had no such luxury. A peasant mother might be back to tending animals, grinding grain, or carrying water within days of giving birth. Survival was a matter not only of health, but of necessity. For the newborn, life was equally precarious. Infant mortality rates in medieval Europe were staggeringly high, with estimates suggesting that between a quarter and half of all children died before reaching their first birthday. The first days were the most perilous. Babies were small, often underweight, and without proper medical care. Even minor complications could prove fatal. Cold was a constant enemy. Newborns were swaddled tightly, their limbs wrapped in cloth bands, partly to keep them warm and partly to ensure they grew straight and strong according to custom. Baptism was of utmost urgency. If the child was born healthy, the family might wait for a priest to perform the rite in church, often within a few days. But if the baby seemed weak or unlikely to survive, the midwife herself would baptize the infant immediately. In this way, even if life was lost, the soul was believed to be safeguarded. The Church's teaching on the fate of unbaptized infants weighed heavily on parents, making baptism not only a spiritual act, but also an emotional shield against grief. For the community, the birth of a child was both a private and public event. Relatives, neighbors, and godparents shared responsibility for the newborn's welfare. Godparents in particular were chosen carefully, for they held spiritual and sometimes material obligations to the child. Their presence at baptism cemented social bonds and strengthened networks of support. Recovery also involved ritual. In many Christian communities, the mother underwent a ceremony known as churching. Roughly 40 days after childbirth, she returned to church to give thanks for her survival and to be ritually purified before rejoining communal life. Though some interpreted the rite as reinforcing the idea of childbirth as polluting, others saw it as a celebration of life preserved against the odds. Either way, it marked a transition back to normalcy after weeks of seclusion and vulnerability. But not all outcomes were joyous. The death of a mother or child cast a heavy shadow. Families faced practical hardship, widowed fathers burdened with infants, households without their central caretaker, or children deprived of maternal care. In noble families, the death of an heir threatened dynastic plans and political alliances. In peasant households, it could mean economic ruin. Survival, in the medieval world, was not merely personal. It was tied to the endurance of the family, the village, and even the larger social order. And yet, despite the ever-present dangers, childbirth persisted as one of the most ordinary and inevitable experiences of life. Generations of women endured its trials, guided by the hands of midwives, the words of priests, and the resilience of their own bodies. Each successful birth added another thread to the fragile fabric of medieval society. Looking back now, it is tempting to dwell on the statistics of death and suffering, but it is also important to recognize the endurance of those who survived. Their experiences, though often hidden in the shadows of history, shape the continuity of communities. Every living descendant of Europe's medieval populations is, in a sense, a testament to those countless moments of survival against daunting odds. As you imagine the quiet of a medieval birthing chamber, the hushed prayers, the flickering candlelight, the sighs of relief when a baby finally cried, you can almost feel how close life and death lay side by side. The mothers and midwives of the Middle Ages carried with them not only the burdens of survival, but also the quiet strength that sustained whole generations. And so, the story of childbirth in the medieval world is not only a tale of pain and risk. It is also a story of resilience, of women's hidden labor, and of the fragile beginnings of life in a time when each new birth was both an ordinary event and a miracle. If the survival of so many hinged on fragile knowledge, inherited customs, and the endurance of the human body, how might our own lives look today if even one of those births had failed? Salt as a necessity of life. Imagine, for a moment, a substance so ordinary that you sprinkle it across your food without a second thought, and yet so vital that entire states built their economies upon it. That substance was salt. In the medieval and early modern world, salt was more than a seasoning. It was a lifeline. It preserved meat through long winters, kept fish edible for weeks at sea, and maintained the health of people and animals alike. Without it, survival was unthinkable. This importance made salt one of the earliest and most reliable sources of taxation. Governments recognized its universal necessity and exploited it, transforming a common mineral into a steady stream of revenue. Across continents, salt taxes shaped trade routes, provoked revolts, and cemented the power of rulers. To study the history of salt taxation is to study a quiet yet powerful force in the machinery of states. Salt itself was not always easily obtained. Depending on geography, it might come from evaporated seawater, from boiling brine springs, or from mining deep underground deposits. Each method required labor, infrastructure, and organization. In regions where salt was scarce, it became a precious commodity, sometimes called white gold. In areas where it was abundant, like coastal flats, rulers still found ways to control access and levy charges. In Europe, one of the most infamous examples of salt taxation was the gabelle of France. First imposed in the 14th century, it became a deeply resented burden that lasted, with interruptions, for centuries. Unlike many taxes, the gabelle was not uniform. Rates varied widely from region to region, creating inequalities that bred discontent. Some provinces paid high prices for mandatory salt purchases, while others were exempt altogether. The result was not only resentment, but also widespread smuggling, as people sought cheaper salt from neighboring areas. China, too, relied heavily on salt taxes centuries before Europe refined the system. The Chinese state recognized that controlling salt production could fund its administration and military. By granting monopolies to merchants and taxing the distribution of salt, dynasties secured steady income while tightening their grip over distant provinces. Salt revenues often accounted for a substantial portion of imperial budgets. It was a tax that, unlike land levies, could not be evaded by the wealthy. Everyone needed salt. In the Islamic world, salt taxation also played a role, particularly along caravan routes that carried salt across the Sahara. Salt from the mines of Tagaza, for example, was transported in massive slabs by camel, traded for gold and other goods, and taxed by rulers along the way. To hold power over salt was to hold power over trade itself. But why was salt such an effective target for taxation? The answer lies in its universality. Unlike luxuries such as silk or wine, salt was indispensable to both rich and poor. It was required daily, not seasonally. And while people could evade taxes on property or income, avoiding the salt tax meant jeopardizing health and survival. Governments understood this reality and capitalized on it. Yet this necessity also made salt taxes a source of bitterness and rebellion. When salt was taxed too heavily, it struck at the most basic needs of the population. Peasants and townspeople alike felt the injustice in their meals and in their preservation of food. Smugglers, often called fauconniers in France, risked imprisonment or execution to supply communities with untaxed salt. In India, British salt taxes would later become a symbol of colonial oppression, sparking one of the most famous protests of the 20th century under Gandhi's leadership. The story of salt taxation, then is not one of abstract numbers on parchment. It is a story of human survival, of governments balancing their hunger for revenue with the needs of their people, and of ordinary families who tasted injustice on their tongues. As you picture a loaf of bread dipped in salted broth, or fish preserved for a winter meal, consider this. The flavor of salt in medieval kitchens carried not only the taste of necessity, but also the weight of political power. But how did these taxes actually work in practice? Who collected them? How were they enforced? And what consequences did they bring to daily life in medieval and early modern societies? Collection, enforcement, and everyday impact. When you think of a tax today, you might picture money deducted from wages or added to the cost of goods at the market. In the medieval and early modern world, however, the mechanics of taxation were far more visible, and salt taxes were among the most intrusive of all. They were not just hidden costs. They were enforced obligations, shaping how people bought, stored, and even thought about their food. In France, under the system of the gabelle, the state went beyond simply taxing salt. It mandated purchases. Households were required to buy a fixed amount of salt each year from official depots, regardless of whether they needed it. Families who consumed less salt still had to pay the same, leading to inevitable resentment. In some regions, the state demanded not only the purchase of salt, but also its use in specific ways, such as salting meat or fish for preservation, ensuring continual demand. Collectors known as gabelliers oversaw distribution and enforcement. They manned salt warehouses and guarded against theft or smuggling. Their presence was deeply unpopular, for they represented the state's intrusion into everyday life. Stories circulated of families caught with illicit salt hidden in sacks of grain or disguised among firewood. Punishments for smuggling were severe, ranging from heavy fines to imprisonment, and in some cases, the gallows. The salt tax was not just a financial burden, it was a source of fear. The unequal nature of the gabelle further inflamed resentment. Some provinces, known as pays de grandes gabelles, paid high rates, while others enjoyed exemptions as pays francs. A family in one town might pay triple the cost of salt compared to their neighbors a few miles away. This disparity fueled widespread smuggling networks, where faussonneurs carried contraband salt across borders. By the 18th century, tens of thousands of smugglers were said to operate in France, some of them organized into bands with their own codes of loyalty and secrecy. China's system, though different, was no less far-reaching. The imperial government often granted monopolies to wealthy merchant families, who in turn paid taxes and ensured steady supply. These salt merchants became some of the richest individuals in China, wielding both economic and political influence. The state benefited, securing revenue for its armies and bureaucracies, but ordinary consumers bore the cost in inflated prices. Complaints about corrupt merchants, diluted salt, or shortages were common. Yet because salt was indispensable, people had no choice but to comply. In the Islamic world and across Africa, enforcement was tied to trade routes. Caravans carrying salt were heavily guarded, and taxed at checkpoints controlled by rulers or tribal authorities. These levies enriched states like Mali and Songhai, whose power rested not only on gold, but also on controlling the lifeline of salt. The slabs themselves were so valuable that they sometimes served as currency, further intertwining salt with political authority. For the ordinary household, the impact was tangible. Salt was not an occasional purchase, but a daily necessity. It flavored bread and stews, preserved meats through winter, and kept dairy products like butter and cheese from spoiling. A shortage of salt could mean hunger, malnutrition, or even starvation. When the price of salt rose due to taxes, the poorest families suffered most. Unlike the wealthy, they could not absorb the cost or stockpile large quantities. Their diets became blander, their ability to preserve food diminished, and their survival more precarious. The burden was not only financial, but also cultural. In Europe, salt was tied to hospitality. To share bread and salt with a guest symbolized trust and fellowship. To withhold it was an insult. Heavy taxes thus struck at more than the stomach. They undermined the very rituals of community life. In Asia, salt was similarly woven into religious offerings and seasonal ceremonies. Its taxation was felt not just in meals, but in traditions and festivals. Over time, resentment grew into open resistance. In France, salt smugglers were often romanticized as folk heroes, defying unjust authority. Villagers sometimes hid them, fed them, or turned a blind eye to their movements. In China, salt merchants occasionally faced riots from desperate consumers. And in regions of Africa, control of salt routes sparked wars between rival kingdoms, each seeking to monopolize the mineral's wealth. Thus, the salt tax was more than an economic policy. It was a constant reminder of the power of rulers over the smallest details of daily existence. Every pinch of salt, every preserved fish, every winter meal bore the invisible hand of the state. And yet, the persistence of salt taxes across so many cultures raises an enduring question. Why? Despite the hardship and unrest they caused, did rulers cling so tightly to this form of revenue? Resistance, reform, and legacy. By now, you can see that the salt tax was never simply a matter of finance. It was a daily burden that reached into kitchens, markets, and family meals. Because it touched the lives of everyone, salt taxation also became a frequent flashpoint for resistance. To understand its full legacy, you must look not only at how it was imposed, but also at how people fought against it, and how its memory lingered long after the systems collapsed. In France, resistance to the gabelle simmered for centuries. Smuggling, as we have seen, was rampant, but it was also organized. Faussonners, illegal salt dealers, became legendary figures, moving through forests and rivers under cover of night. They were pursued by salt guards, tried in harsh courts, and punished with severity. Yet no matter how strict the enforcement, the trade persisted. Families sometimes relied on smuggled salt to survive the winter, making smugglers both outlaws and benefactors in the eyes of their communities. The resentment fueled broader political unrest. During the French Revolution of 1789, the gabelle was one of the most hated symbols of royal injustice. Revolutionaries targeted it early, and in 1790 the National Assembly formally abolished the tax. To the people of France, its removal was more than financial relief. It was liberation from generations of unequal and oppressive control. And yet, the state still needed money. The salt tax was later reinstated under Napoleon, though less harshly, and persisted in some form well into the 20th century, a lingering reminder of its powerful hold on French history. In China, the salt monopoly endured for millennia, adapting to changing dynasties and political realities. By controlling production and granting licenses, the state ensured a constant flow of income, even during times of war or famine. But the system also bred corruption. Powerful salt merchants colluded with officials, hoarding supplies and raising prices. Periodically, reformers attempted to dismantle or regulate the monopoly, but the economic reliance on salt revenue made lasting change difficult. It was not until the 20th century, with the fall of imperial rule and later political upheavals, that China's salt tax system finally dissolved. Its legacy, however, lived on in the memory of ordinary people who had borne its cost for centuries. Elsewhere, the story followed similar patterns. In India, the British colonial salt tax became a focal point of protest. The 1930 Salt March, led by Mohandas Gandhi, captured the world's attention as thousands of Indians walked to the sea to make their own salt in defiance of imperial restrictions. It was a turning point in the struggle for independence, showing how a simple mineral could ignite a mass movement. Gandhi's choice of salt was deliberate. It was a necessity shared by rich and poor, a symbol of both life and oppression. His protest echoed earlier centuries of resistance, linking medieval burdens to modern struggles. Across Africa, control of salt routes fueled wars, shifting alliances, and the rise of empires. From the Sahara to the savannas, rulers who controlled salt controlled power. When European colonizers later imposed their own taxes on salt, they tapped into long-standing traditions of monopoly, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes disrupting existing systems. In every case, salt remained inseparable from authority. The legacy of salt taxation can still be felt today, though not in the same direct way. Modern states rarely tax salt specifically, but the principle of taxing universal necessities endures. Excise taxes on fuel, alcohol, and tobacco echo the same logic. Target goods that are widely consumed, difficult to avoid, and capable of generating steady revenue. The salt tax, in this sense, was a prototype for modern fiscal policy. Yet its human impact is equally important to remember. Salt taxes remind us how deeply governments can intrude into the most basic elements of life. They reveal how political power often rests not on grand battles or royal decrees, but on the daily act of eating, preserving, and surviving. They also demonstrate the resilience of ordinary people who resisted in ways large and small, from smuggling in the French countryside to marching along India's coast. As you reflect on this long history, you may notice how something as simple as salt could carry so much weight. It flavored not only food but also the politics, economies, and rebellions of entire civilizations. Its story is one of endurance and tension, of rulers grasping for revenue and people pushing back in defense of necessity. And so, the next time you scatter a pinch of salt across your meal, consider this. Once, that tiny grain was a symbol of struggle, injustice, and resilience, a reminder that even the blandest of substances can hold the sharpest of histories. If entire empires were shaped by the taxation of salt, what does that say about the hidden power of the everyday necessities we often take for granted today? Ale as the drink of necessity. When you imagine medieval Europe, you may picture castles, knights, and bustling markets. Yet beneath these grand images lay the daily rhythms of ordinary life, and at the very center of survival stood something surprisingly humble: ale. Not just a drink for merriment. Ale was the everyday fuel of villages, towns, and cities. For centuries, it was safer than water, cheaper than wine, and essential to both nutrition and social order. To begin, you must first set aside modern assumptions. Ale in the Middle Ages was not the strong, hoppy drink you might recognize today. Instead, it was often weak in alcohol content, lightly flavored, and consumed by everyone, from peasants in their fields to monks in their cloisters, and even children at their family tables. This small ale, as it was sometimes called, contained just enough alcohol to kill harmful bacteria, making it far safer than untreated water from rivers or wells. Water supplies in the medieval world were unreliable. In rural villages, wells could become contaminated by nearby livestock or by runoff from latrines. In towns and cities, the problem was worse. Waste disposal was primitive, and rivers often doubled as both water sources and dumping grounds for refuse. To drink plain water was to take a gamble, but brewing ale required boiling water, which killed dangerous microbes, and fermentation created a mildly antiseptic environment. Thus, ale became a dependable safeguard against illness. But ale was not only about safety. It was also a source of calories. In a time when diets leaned heavily on grains and vegetables, ale provided a liquid form of nourishment. The grains used in brewing released sugars and nutrients, making ale a kind of liquid bread. For laborers in the fields or craftsmen in towns, a cup of ale offered both refreshment and sustenance, restoring energy for long hours of work. The production of ale was also deeply embedded in community life. In most villages, brewing was a domestic craft, carried out primarily by women. Known as alewives, these women brewed small batches in their homes, supplying their families and often selling the surplus to neighbors. Brewing equipment was simple: large pots for boiling, wooden tubs for fermenting, and earthenware jugs or barrels for storage. Ingredients were equally basic: barley or oats for the grain, water, and sometimes herbs or flavorings. Before hops became common in later centuries, brewers relied on mixtures of herbs known as grut. These could include bog myrtle, yarrow, or juniper, which added bitterness and preservative qualities. Recipes varied from region to region, reflecting local traditions and available plants. Each village's ale had its own distinct taste, tied closely to its landscape. Ale was not only consumed in homes, but also in communal settings. Taverns and alehouses dotted towns and countryside alike, serving as centers of social life. There, villagers gathered to share news, arrange business, and celebrate festivals. Monasteries, too, became renowned centers of brewing, producing not only ale for their own consumption, but also surplus for sale. The discipline and resources of monastic communities allowed them to refine techniques, raising both the quality and consistency of their brews. For children, small ale was an ordinary part of the diet. It may seem strange to you now, but in a world where safe water was scarce, ale was often the safer option. Its low alcohol content meant it was not intoxicating in the way stronger drinks were. Indeed, entire households might drink ale with breakfast, continue with it through midday meals, and end the day with another round. The importance of ale went beyond health and nourishment. It was woven into the rhythms of the agricultural year. Brewing was tied to harvests, for fresh grain meant new batches of ale. Feasts and religious festivals demanded larger quantities, and shortages were keenly felt during poor harvest years. In some places, authorities even regulated ale production, setting prices or punishing dishonest brewers who watered down their product. Thus, ale was more than a drink. It was a cornerstone of medieval survival. It bridged the gap between necessity and culture, between health and hospitality. For peasants, it was the steady companion of their labors. For monks, it was a tool of discipline and charity. For whole communities, it was the binding liquid of daily life. And yet, as ale became more than just sustenance, as it grew into an economic commodity, a source of taxation, and a trade, its role in society began to shift. Brewing, once a domestic task, would evolve into a commercial enterprise, reshaping both economies and communities. But how exactly did this transformation occur? How did a household necessity become an industry? And what consequences did that bring to the villages and towns of medieval Europe? From household brewing to commercial enterprise. By the High Middle Ages, the role of ale in daily life was so central that brewing began to outgrow the confines of the household. What had once been a domestic duty, performed mainly by women for their families and neighbors, gradually transformed into a structured trade. This shift reflected not only economic opportunity, but also the growing demand of larger, more complex societies. At the heart of this transition was scale. In small villages, a woman might brew a few gallons at a time, enough to supply her household and perhaps sell a little extra to neighbors. But as towns expanded, population swelled, and markets grew busier, the need for ale increased beyond what domestic brewing alone could provide. Soldiers in garrisons, workers in cities, and pilgrims on the road all needed reliable supplies. Brewing, once casual, became organized and commercial. Women, the traditional alewives, often stood at the center of this early commercial brewing. They displayed their trade by hanging a simple sign, a broom or ale stake, outside their door. Neighbors and passers-by would know ale was for sale, much like a modern tavern sign. For many women, brewing offered a rare source of independent income, allowing them to support their families or supplement household earnings. Some alewives gained local reputations for the quality of their brews, becoming fixtures of their communities. Yet as brewing became more profitable, it also attracted regulation and competition. Authorities recognized both the importance of ale and the potential for revenue. In England, the assize of bread and ale, first established in the 13th century, set standards for pricing and quality. Officials known as ale tasters or ale conners patrolled taverns and homes, checking to ensure that ale was not watered down, overcharged, or otherwise dishonest. Violations could result in fines, public shaming, or even the destruction of a brewer's equipment. Monasteries played an increasingly important role in this shift. With their resources, discipline, and access to land, monks could brew on a much larger scale than ordinary households. Monastic brewing not only sustained the monks themselves, who often consumed substantial quantities as part of their daily diet, but also generated revenue through sales to travelers and locals. Over time, monastic brews gained reputations for consistency and strength, setting standards that influenced the wider brewing world. Another turning point came with the growing use of hops. Before their introduction, ale was flavored and preserved with mixtures of herbs known as grut. Hops, however, offered a more effective preservative, extending the shelf life of ale and allowing it to be transported and sold over greater distances. By the late Middle Ages, hopped beer, especially in Northern Europe, began to supplant traditional ale. This shift was not immediate and often provoked resistance, as traditional grip brewers defended their craft. But the advantages of hops were undeniable, and their adoption marked the beginning of brewing as a large-scale, long-distance trade. The commercialization of brewing also altered its gender dynamics. While women remained active in local ale selling, larger operations often came under the control of men who had greater access to capital, guild networks, and civic authority. Brewing guilds emerged in towns and cities, setting rules for quality, membership, and apprenticeship. These guilds often excluded women or limited their participation, gradually pushing them out of the more profitable aspects of the trade. Taxes soon followed. Just as governments once exploited the necessity of salt, they saw the same opportunity in ale. Levies on brewing, licenses for taverns, and duties on ingredients became common. For rulers, ale was a reliable source of revenue, because no community could do without it. For common people, these taxes were yet another burden layered onto a drink that was both necessity and comfort. Despite regulation and taxation, the demand for ale continued to grow. Taverns became centers of social life in towns, offering not just drink, but also news, gambling, and entertainment. They provided space for guild meetings, political discussions, and even plots of rebellion. Alehouses were sometimes viewed with suspicion by authorities, not only because of drunkenness, but also because of the dangerous freedom of conversation that they fostered. Thus, what began as a humble domestic practice evolved into a complex institution, touching nearly every aspect of medieval society: gender roles, religion, economy, and politics. Ale was no longer just a drink at the family table. It was an industry, a source of revenue, and a force in public life. But with this expansion came new tensions. If ale had once been a symbol of sustenance and community, what happened when it became entangled with profit, regulation, and power? Did it still nourish villages in the same way, or did it begin to divide them? Ale, community, and the burden of regulation. By the later Middle Ages, ale was no longer just a drink of survival. It had become a nexus of community life, a target of authority, and a symbol of both unity and control. To truly understand its role in keeping villages alive, you must look beyond its brewing and consumption and into the ways it shaped social bonds, communal rituals, and political tensions. Alehouses were at the heart of this transformation. In villages, they were often little more than private homes where neighbors gathered, but in towns and cities, they grew into bustling establishments. Within their walls, all classes of people mingled: laborers, merchants, even officials. News spread by word of mouth, songs filled the air, and disputes were both sparked and settled over shared cups. Taverns and alehouses became informal courts of opinion, where people discussed prices, taxes, and local grievances. In this way, ale was not just a beverage, it was the fuel of public conversation. For communities, ale also served ceremonial roles. Weddings, christenings, and festivals were unthinkable without ample supplies. During harvest celebrations, barrels were broached as tokens of gratitude for the year's bounty. At funerals, mourners shared ale as both comfort and ritual. In monasteries, ale was tied to discipline and charity, brewed not only for monks, but also for guests and the poor. Ale, therefore, was not merely a daily necessity, but a marker of life's milestones, binding people together in times of joy and sorrow alike. Yet as communal reliance on ale deepened, so too did the state's interest in controlling it. In England, the assize of bread and ale had already laid the groundwork for regulation, but enforcement grew stricter over time. Ale tasters patrolled towns, dipping their lips into mugs to ensure quality and fairness. Their presence was meant to protect consumers, but it also reinforced the authority of civic government. Taxes, however, became the true burden. In many regions, rulers imposed levies on brewing, on the sale of ale, or on the ingredients themselves. These taxes were justified as necessary to fund defenses, build infrastructure, or maintain courts. But to ordinary villagers, they were yet another intrusion into the most basic element of daily life. Just as with salt, taxation on ale struck directly at survival, breeding resentment. In some cases, resentment turned to resistance. Records describe villagers protesting unfair ale prices or brewers accused of watering down their product to stretch profits. In cities, taverns sometimes became centers of unrest, where conspiracies against local lords or even kings took shape. Authorities were well aware of this danger. To them, the tavern was not just a place of drink, but also of dangerous talk. The cultural image of alewives shifted as well. Once respected providers, they were increasingly caricatured in literature and art as greedy, dishonest, or morally suspect. These stereotypes reflected deeper anxieties about women's independence in an economy where profit was becoming more significant. As male-dominated guilds took control of brewing, women were gradually pushed back to the margins of the trade. The household role of brewing persisted, but large-scale production became firmly tied to commerce and male authority. Despite these tensions, ale remained indispensable. In times of plague or famine, when uncertainty shadowed every household, ale offered a small measure of consistency. Even when taxed and regulated, even when mocked in satire or blamed for disorder, it continued to nourish and sustain. It was the ordinary miracle of the medieval world, boiled, fermented grain that gave life when water could not be trusted. The legacy of medieval ale extends beyond its time. Brewing traditions carried into the early modern era laid the foundation for Europe's beer culture today. Techniques refined in monasteries and regulated by guilds shaped the beverages poured in taverns centuries later. The everyday reliance on ale also reminds us how deeply human survival has always been tied to humble, practical solutions. And so, when you think of medieval ale, you should not picture only drunken feasts or rowdy taverns. Instead, imagine a farmer sipping from a wooden cup after a long day in the fields, or a child drinking weak ale at breakfast, or neighbors sharing a jug at a harvest festival. These ordinary acts of drinking were acts of survival, of resilience, and of quiet joy. If something as humble as ale could hold communities together, nourish bodies, and at the same time provoke regulation, taxation, and unrest, what does that say about the hidden power of the simplest staples in human history?